Hey everyone, it's Joe Waxman, and in this video, I want to look at the chart of Immanuel Kant, the famous philosopher, one of the most influential philosophers of modern times. And before I begin, don't forget to hit the like button, guys, and subscribe if you haven't, and share it if you like, and hit the bell notification. I'm going to share my screen. All right. So we know he's a philosopher. He's got a pretty spread out chart, so he's very diverse. I mean, if you're just talking about like the overall shape of things, and I think that's good to take into account initially when you're just trying to get a feel for what's going on. And then if we look at, just to understand some things, that well, he's got his Jupiter in Aquarius, very prominent, high in the sky. It's not conjunct his MC. Saturn is conjunct his MC, and Saturn is in the 9th whole sign house, right? So if you take the MC to which whole sign house, you can get a better idea about, where a person's main focus, career focus will be. So 9th house, obviously, philosophy, religion, higher studies. Saturn, it's much more scientific. Saturn in Capricorn, good dignity, conjunct the MC in domicile. So something philosophical, scientific. Jupiter, very prominent in Aquarius, also ruled by Saturn, so scientific. Thinking about society as well. And I want to bring up the Wikipedia because I think it's important to understand what he really stood for, because Jupiter in Aquarius is not a simple philosophy. It's not like mine, like Jupiter in Taurus, where everything can be really, really simple, or Jupiter in Aries, where it's, just very pointed and inspirational. This is a very complicated philosophy, and that's why I want to bring this up, so I don't want to mischaracterize the essence of Kant. So I need a little help here. All right, he was a German philosopher, one of the central Enlightenment thinkers. Now, Enlightenment, as he defines it, is it was an intellectual and philosophical movement that dominated Europe. Might come to some quote at some point, but it was basically the courage to think independently. And he emphasized courage because he said it wasn't a lack of intellect, but more a lack of courage that didn't allow people to think independently and for themselves and critically. I generally agree with that. However, I think one follows the other, that if you're not going to use your critical thinking and independent thinking ability, then like a muscle, it grows very weak and tends to atrophy. So yeah, that's the Enlightenment part of things. Comprehensive and systematic works in epistemology, or the theory of knowledge, which will make sense of once we come into metaphysics, ethics, and aesthetics. So he's very varied. He's very broad, and you can see that in his chart. Made him one of the most influential figures in modern Western philosophy. In his doctrine of transcendental idealism, this is very complicated. This is Jupiter in Aquarius. Philosophical system founded by Kant in the 18th century. Kant's program found throughout the Critique of Pure Reason. I'm just going to go to this. We have to break it down a little bit. Aquarius is so intellectual and complicated. Philosophical system founded by Kant, found throughout his Critique of Pure Reason. He's very intellectual. Critique of Pure Reason. By transcendental, term that deserves special clarification. Kant means that his philosophical approach to knowledge transcends mere consideration of sensory evidence. So it's beyond the sensory experience. I think that was part of that was called, I think that was comprehensively called empiricism. Understanding the mind's innate modes of processing that sensory evidence. Transcendental aesthetic section. Kant outlines how space and time are pure forms of human intuition contributed by your own faculty of sensibility. Space and time do not have an existence outside of us, but are subjective forms of our sensibility, and hence the necessary a priori conditions under which the objects we encounter in our experience can appear to us at all. So he's saying it's obviously subjective, that it's based in our experiences. Kant describes time and space as empirically real, but transcendentally ideal. Empirical means evidence-based, sensory, experiential, but transcendentally ideal. I'm not sure how he defines transcendental. Kant argues that the conscious subject cognizes the objects of experience not as they are in themselves, but only the way they appear to us under the conditions of our sensibility. So that we're not experiencing the objective reality, but rather the subjective, based on our experience. All of this makes me want to contrast it to the Advaita Vedanta philosophy that, or understanding rather, that it's all in the mind, which I tend towards because it's very simple and it makes sense, and it's the most, when you boil it down, it's the most truthful way of looking at it, in my experience. This gets very intellectual, very abstract. As Kant's doctrine restricts the scope of our cognition to appearance given to our sensibility and denies that we can possess cognition of things as they are in themselves, which I tend to agree. It's all experiential, it's all subjective. And this again points back to the spiritual realization that reality is illusory. It's based on our own perception, our own conditioning, our own experience. Things as they are independently of how we experience them through our cognitive difficulties. Okay, I'm not going to go into any more of that. I just want to get a solid base for what he believed, because otherwise it doesn't make sense. There's no, we need to include that. So that's transcendental idealism. Very, very, it needs some distillation. You really have to kind of pull it apart to try and understand what he's saying. Kant argued that space and time are mere forms of intuition which structure all experience, and therefore that while things in themselves, this is the concept he came up with, is an object as it is, sort of like objective truth, objective reality. Concept led to much controversy among closely read. While things in themselves exist, I'm going to say objective reality exists and contributes to experience, they're nonetheless distinct from the objects of experience. So that's like saying that while the sun exists, it's distinct from our experience of the sun. So conceptually, I would agree with that. From this, it follows that the objects of experience are mere appearances, and that the nature of things as they are in themselves is unknowable to us. The nature of things as they are in themselves is unknowable to us. Well, again, if you bring it back to this Advaita, which he's not an Advaitist, but this is my background, and I'm trying to make sense of this. Advaita or Zen understanding that anything external to us is unknowable, and that the way to know anything is through our internal experience. And that's why these traditions are so fundamentally about sitting quietly, turned inward, and getting to know who you are. Who am I? That's the central question of Advaita Vedanta. It says, how can you know what anything else is if you don't know what you are? So in other words, what I'm pointing to is that he's arriving in a very scientific way at a spiritual perspective. That's my take on all this. He's coming to a very spiritual, sublime truth that we can't know anything actually outside of our own experience. And that in order to know anything fully, it has to come back to our own experience of the thing. Our own knowing. The knowingness is inside of us, not external. And he says that. And the nature of things as they are in themselves is unknowable to us. This is very wise. He's coming to a real truth through his own thinking. This is his enlightenment, right? Because he was part of the Enlightenment thinkers. He's coming to his own enlightenment through the courage to think for himself. In an attempt to counter the skepticism he found in the writings of David Hume, he wrote The Critique of Pure Reason, one of his most well-known works. In it, he developed his theory of experience to answer the question of whether synthetic, a priori knowledge, this is very complicated. I looked into it. Synthetic is theoretical. A priori is previous knowledge, knowledge that's already established, the fields of knowledge that are already established. Synthetic, previously established fields of knowledge is possible. Theoretical, which would in turn make it possible to determine the limits of metaphysical inquiry. Kant drew a parallel to the Copernican revolution in his proposal to think of the objects of the senses as conforming to our spatial and temporal forms of intuition. So like, you guys get how complicated this is? This is Jupiter in Aquarius. He's like, I mean, Aquarius is a prime number. It's 11. 11 is the prime number. You have to take the numbers into account. They're significant. The number of Aquarius is 11. It's a prime number. It's very complicated, but it's prime at the same time. It's indivisible by any other number besides one in itself. Proposal thing of objects and senses are conforming to our spatial and temporal forms of intuition. Intuition. So that we have a priori cognition of these objects. I'm not really sure what the Copernican revolution is. This paradigm shift from the Ptolemaic model of the heavens, which described the cosmos as having or stationary. Okay. Okay, so that's the sun, right? Yeah, the sun is the center of the solar system. Conjure a parallel to the Copernican revolution in his proposal to think of the objects of the senses, as conforming to our spatial and temporal forms of intuition, so that we have a priori cognition of those. Well, he's tying it into intuition, but it's all very complicated. I can't believe that reason is also the source of morality. Reason is the source of morality, he says. Is reason the source of morality? Do we not kill because we're like thinking about it, like killing each other because we're like, it would be a bad idea to kill you. Let me reason this. Or is it more because we can feel it in our heart and we're human beings? And so that would be a question I have, and I tend to lean towards more the that morality is not an object of reason, but an object of our heartfelt humanity, that it feels bad, right? We have this sense of love and the pained heart that comes from betraying that love, you could say, right? Like if we hurt someone, we feel guilty, we feel bad, we feel ashamed, we feel hurt that we hurt them. Unless we become numb. Some people choose that path because they want to keep hurting people because they're very egotistical. Then they become numb, then they stop feeling it. But if we don't become numb, then if we hurt someone, we feel bad. And so that would be my, unless I'm misunderstanding him, that would be my understanding of morality. Or maybe morality is completely, maybe people need morality because they're completely cut off from their sense of humanity. That's also possible. And then in that case, they need a reason to be moral. It is wrong to go and kill other people. All right, I'm gonna skip ahead because I don't want to take too much time on this. Kant's views, especially the fields of epistemology, ethics, political theory, and postmodern aesthetics. And to explain the reason in human experience, failures of philosophy and metaphysics. He regarded himself as showing the way past the impasse between rationalists and empiricists. Empiricists are the experiential ones, and rationalists are the intellectual ones. Is why that's my Jupiter and Taurus simplified version of philosophy. It is widely held to have synthesized both traditions in his thought. Kant was an exponent of the idea that perpetual peace. He was very, one of the things about Kant is that he was a developed soul. Like he was moving towards the spiritual view of things, and he was very strong proponent of peace and perpetual peace. Peace is permanently established could be secured through universal democracy. Well, that's a laugh. Democracy is the Salem witch hunt, right? That's mob rule. Democracy is a lot of people criticize democracy. It's okay, but not on its own. You need, well, so far politically the best system we've had is a democratic republic, which is what we are. We're a republic first, which means rule by law. Rule by law would ideally protects the minority, which we're seeing the decay of our republic, but rule by law protects the minority, including so-called witches or Jews or blacks or whoever. I don't know, I said the witches is the quote, it's not the Jews. It protects the minority, and the smallest minority, as Ayn Rand points out, is the individual. If you have, a bunch of people agreeing on a subject that where you're in the minority, and it hurts you as a minority, the law ideally would protect you, whereas democracy would not. Anyway. And the international cooperation. Yeah, so I don't necessarily agree with all his ideas, but generally I can agree with a lot of them. And that perhaps this could be the culminating stage of world history. Seems a bit naive. Universal democracy and international cooperation, of course, yeah. The nature of Kant's religious views continue to be the subject of scholarly dispute, with the viewpoints ranging from the impression that he shifted an early defense of an ontological argument for the existence of God to a principled agnosticism. He seems to ride the edge between, God, religion, and no God, no religion, purely materialistic, scientific. Anyway, he was criticized by Nietzsche, who claimed that Kant had theologian blood and was merely sophisticated apologist for the traditional Christian faith. He is also criticized for racism presented in some of his lesser known papers, such as on the use of teleological principles in philosophy and on the different races of man. Although he was proponent of scientific racism for much of his career, Kant's view on race changed significantly in the last decade of his life and ultimately rejected racial hierarchies in European colonialism in A Perpetual Peace, a philosophical sketch. Okay, so he grew out of his scientific racism. That's good. Kant published other important works on ethics, religion, law, aesthetics, astronomy, and history during his lifetime. Universal natural history, blah, 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 blah. All right, I'm going to share my software again. Okay. I just wanted to establish that as a basis because you can see his chart is quite spread out, and Aquarius tends to be so complicated that it's good to establish a general view of his work because he was such an influential philosopher. So he's got Sun in Taurus in the 12th first house. I mean, it's pretty close to the ascendant. That's, you know, it does carry a 12th house flavor, but I think we could say first house with 12th house secondary qualities. And Sun is ruling, his houses are a bit screwed up. 4th whole sign, but 5th quadrant. So, I mean, that's quite good for creative work, for, you know, I mean, 4th house would be good for politics, 4th and the 1st, because representing the homeland. And at least he's thinking about politics. He's thinking about the world stage. I mean, that's more Aquarius in 11th house, but he's thinking about, you know, representing his homeland. And 5th house is also quite good for all creative work and performance. And 1st house Sun, it's angular. It's pulling in some 12th house creativity, imagination. It's making him very prominent. And Taurus is quite good. I think people often underestimate Taurus as far as its intellectual abilities. Yes, ruled by Venus. Yes, it has a lot to do with beauty and art and aesthetics. And he did work in aesthetics, you know, finances, security, materialism. But it's also, Taurus is, do not ever be fooled by, a lot of philosophers have Taurus Sun, first of all, because Taurus really helps simplify the thinking. And that's very crucial for being able to, you know, if you get too complicated, which he is very complicated, so he needs some Taurus energy to really simplify and ground it. Otherwise, it just becomes too hyper intellectual and loses touch with reality. You know, Taurus is that element that brings it down to the practical level. What good is it if it's so intellectual that nobody can even use it or make any sense of it, right? Taurus is that thing. It's like the lowest common denominator is always Taurus, right? Because, I mean, Aries is pre-Taurus. It's gut level, instinctual. That's why Taurus, Aries is so inspiring. Like, you can really get at the central point with Aries, but with Taurus, you can break it down into its most simple duality and explain it. Like, Aries is not, you don't explain Aries, you just do Aries. But Taurus is actually the first level of explanation, where you can actually break things, because it's two, right? So it has this intellectual quality, Taurus. Aries is just pure inspiration, right? It's spirit. Aries is that spirit, that spark, right? That can really get people going. And it's not intellectual. You feel Aries. You don't think Aries. Right. So he has that Taurian vibe. Venus, the rulers in Gemini in the 2nd house. So this is excellent for, bringing in that intellect. It's the values. So he's valuing the intellect, and Venus is also the joy. So he enjoys communication and thinking and being intellectual. It's good for speaking and teaching. And, Gemini is so curious that, and this is knowledge. And I don't want to open up his webpage, Wikipedia again, but knowledge was part of his theory of enlightenment, I think. Transcendental idealism had to do with knowledge. Okay. Knowledge is second house. Well, it's also Aquarius. I mean, knowledge as in, like resources, like if you're knowledge in the sense of like having intellectual resources is very second house, but knowing is very Aquarian. Sometimes the two are conflated, knowledge and knowing. But that's the way I differentiate it anyway. There's Moon, Mercury, and Chiron are all in the 12th house in Aries. And again, this is very inspirational, very creative. He's pulling from the subconscious. He's going into like really deep spiritual kind of thinking in a very Aryan way. Moon, Mercury is very good at expressing that the inner mind, because Mercury then is connected to the moon, so like the inner thinking becomes it's able to express itself. And this is good because the 12th house is often hidden. So Mercury here can help process, intellectualize the very deep nature of the 12th house. Chiron also, besides being wounded reject, is also very intellectual. If you look at the orbit of Chiron, it actually has a funny orbit between that goes between Saturn and Uranus. So Saturn and Uranus are both very intellectual planets. Scientific, both co-rulers of Aquarius. And Chiron has most association with Virgo. So it has this very intellectual quality as well. It's definitely not a personal planet. It is much more of it does have personal implications, but it's quite big, and in its most evolved state, it is the healer and the teacher and the shaman. So it's very, very intellectual as well. So it has like the scientific quality. Anyway, all that's to say that it's not even being aspected, see here. But this is a helpful planet for any, especially if it's not negatively aspected, then it's, then it's just gonna play a positive, helpful, supportive role. In any case, Moon also is in a mutual reception with Mars. Mars is debilitated here in Cancer. Moon is in Mars' sign, Mars and Moon sign, and they are connected by a square, applying square. So this is going to get even more intense as he gets older. Moon square Mars is definitely quite an aggressive square, but it's alleviated by this mutual reception. Now, whether you want to call this third or fourth house, I tend to see it as his home is in the third house of his intellect. So he's very at home in his intellect, right? If you want to combine the two, his home is intellectual, right? Often, if you see the IC in the fourth house, then it's more like home is where the heart is. This is a much more emotional, creative IC. His is much more of an intellectual, expressive IC. He's very at home with his intellect, and it's trading places with the 12th house, third and 12th house, fourth and 12th house as well, third, fourth, The fourth is in the third. Third, fourth, and 12th. So that the subconscious 12th house is coming into his intellect, and he's able to express it very well. Mars is very initiating and very active and very driven. And so if you look at his life work, I mean, he was incredibly prolific. He philosophized about everything. Very varied. Even scientific stuff, like astronomical stuff. As well as purely philosophical. And I think this is a big part of why he was so successful, because he was really able to pull out a lot from this 12th house, because the 12th house is often lost. It's creative people get a lot from the 12th house, because when you're being creative, you can access that 12th house, whether it's music or arts or dance or anything like that, because you're not using the rational mind. But to take from the 12th house and draw from it in a rational, intellectual way, that's difficult. That's much more difficult to get pull intellectual knowledge from the 12th house. And I think he was doing that because of the 12th house, third house connection. And then the Mars and Aries, Mars in Aries is so active, right? It's so forceful. It's not going to be too passive. And you kind of need that with the 12th house, where things just tend to get lost in ambiguity and fog and delusion and fantasy. You need that. The burning, forceful quality, initiating quality of Mars to pull it out. Excuse me. And then Mercury as well, to make it much more rational and intellectual and expressive. I think that's really key here. I also included white moon Selena in here because it's conjuncting the Mars and it's in Cancer. And there was this very good nature about him, Kant. And I think that probably has to do with white moon Selena, because people have heard of black moon Lilith, and that represents a very dark part of ourselves. White moon Lilith represents the polarity to black moon, and it's a very auspicious, positive element in our charts that represents goodness and beneficial, hopeful qualities. And it's either, I confuse the terms, but it's the point where the moon is closest to the Earth, where it orbits closest to the Earth. And is that apogee? I'm not sure. Don't quote me on that one. But it is also opposite Saturn. Okay. And then Saturn also is square moon, but it's a separating square. Moon's moving more to square with Mars, but that's a better square because of the nature that they have. They're switching houses. They're trading energetically exchanging, versus this moon Saturn square, which would be very restrictive. And he grew up, this does describe his childhood, because because moon is ruling the IC. And he grew up very disciplined, very strict, religious, structured, right? And that's the Saturn square moon. Even though Saturn's in very good dignity here in Capricorn, it is retrograde, which means that his Saturnian scientific structure is going against the grain. He's not afraid to do things differently or to think things differently. it's square the moon. So that's definitely like a very difficult childhood, or at least a very disciplined, structured childhood, which he did have, religious and structured, disciplined. And he himself was very religious. Now, I'm sorry, he was not religious. Saturn generally restricts and denies religion, or creates a very dogmatic, hard religion. But in any case, he was very disciplined and structured throughout his life. And they said, you know, he lived by the clock, and you could, you know, time his walks. If you were observing him, like he would just walk at the same time every day and just do everything by schedule. And that's very Saturnian. Yeah, I mean, that's, you know, I'm similar, and I my Saturn is actually in the 9th quadrant, 10th whole sign house. Like right, it'll be right there, except in Leo, 0 degrees Leo right there. But then the MC is over here. Anyway, Saturn is conjunct the MC, but if you look at the square to the ascendant, which indicates the highest point in the sky, it's actually Jupiter. So between Jupiter and Saturn, but Saturn's in the 9th whole sign house. So his career is, and MC is in the 9th whole sign house. So his career is, well, philosophical, right? It's denying religion with the Saturn and Capricorn. So we could definitely say like a philosophical, but scientifically philosophical, right? And we see that whenever Jupiter is tending towards, you know, relationship with Saturn, and then it definitely becomes much more, either, you know, if they were born, I would say this, if they were born in a very religious culture, religiously dominant culture, they would either be secretly atheistic or be very dogmatically religious, very, very strictly religious. But in any case, if it wasn't, then it tends much more towards scientific kind of philosophy. Jupiter and Saturn connected, and here Jupiter is in the sign of Saturn, it's in Aquarius, and Saturn is in domicile, very strong. So Jupiter and Saturn are very strong in his chart, very prominent, as is the Sun, and the nodes in Neptune also angular. He remains single throughout his life, with South Node in the 7th, pretty much alone, besides Uranus pretty far away. Uranus wouldn't help anyway, as far as finding mates. But he stayed single, and he did not have any children either. And then Pluto in the 5th house. Pluto kind of brings up this idea of death and rebirth. And so some things could, you know, if it was just on its own, it doesn't look too promising for children or mate. Mars ruling the 7th, debilitated, and trading places with the 12th. Either one is not, you know, doesn't seem that promising for a partner. North Node is in the 1st, conjunct Neptune, and Neptune obviously is very imaginative, idealistic. You know, it's all this transcendental idealism that he brought into his philosophy. He's obviously very scientific and firm with his thinking. Like his thinking is not loosey-goosey, but it does tend, especially as he gets older, he's tending towards this very much more spiritual and you know, Neptunian. He's bringing in a lot of Neptunian elements into this very scientific philosophy, which is nice and makes it much more well-rounded. In addition, Pluto is also nicely trining the North Node and Neptune. So he's bringing in, that's harmonizing well with his overall drive, motion, forward motion, in his philosophies and his thinking. Pluto's very deep thinking, psychological, penetrating insights into things. Pluto's a very intellectual planet. I mean, besides everything else that it's associated with, it really digs deep, creates incredible depth of insight and thinking. and awareness. Yeah. You know, especially if it's well aspected. If it's positively aspected, then it's really bringing out the best in that penetrating insight, depth. Right? So that's actually quite good for this, as far as his ability to really be able to think well. And if you look at the degrees, then we get, you know, Saturn, Jupiter, and Venus, and even ascendant. Well, these ascendants at 9 degrees, but all 3 of these are at 10 degrees. So they're all kind of connecting in a weird way. Well, Jupiter and Venus are connecting. So his philosophy is bringing in an intellectual Venus. So aesthetics were part of his philosophy, but just in general, Venus in Gemini, Jupiter in Aquarius, trine each other by the degree. Exactly. That's a very strong trine. That's going to create a very nice philosophy. It's going to very warm philosophy. And although he doesn't have any planets in Libra, you know, Venus rules Libra, so that's where the peace is coming in from within his philosophy, right? He's taking a lot of these Venusian ideas of peace and beauty and harmony. The enlightenment, I think, comes from Uranus in Scorpio, pulling in the 6th house elements, even though it's in the same sign, you know, close enough to the 7th house cusp that it's also 7th house, but I think it's still pulling in some 6th house elements. And the 6th house is very analytical, very hardworking, and service to others, all the associations. But with Uranus is all about independence and independent mindedness, independent thinking. The enlightened Uranus is the great awakener, so it actually represents enlightenment. And the 6th house is the daily grind, right? So he's working hard at thinking for himself. That's literally what's going on here. And Uranus tends to do very well in Scorpio, where it's often said to be exalted. Uranus is also opposite the sun. So we're getting that double influence. It's you know, an opposition is not great, but it's still a strong connection, and you know, influences whatever planet is touching. So he's very connected to Uranus, and it's making him brilliant. Oppositional, the opposition tends to make a person kind of relate this way in relation to others. So he's going to be argumentative, right? And he's going to be inspired by his interactions with other people and other philosophies, and he's always going to want to, you know, write a critique of this philosophy and a response to that philosophy, and like that. You know, it's very in oppositional relationship that he becomes Uranian. But nonetheless, it's there, very prominent. What else? Saturn is in conjunct Venus. You know, it's trine Jupiter in conjunct Venus. Well, Saturn does like Venus. It's exalted in Venus's sign, but this in conjunction, it's difficult for Venus, especially. You know, Venus has the trine to Jupiter, which is good, and then an in conjunct from Saturn. So there's some struggle there, you know, some good, bad challenges, and let's see. Venus is his ascendant lord, so that could pose some health issues. Yeah, not really sure how it manifested. I know. Well, Venus is in the 2nd house, and I don't think he, you know, generally I would say this is great for wealth, but I think Saturn in conjunct Venus made it so that he wasn't wealthy. Jupiter probably mitigated that, you know, helped him out. there, but I don't think he was, it was kind of, push-pull between Jupiter and Saturn, so it was mediocre. Definitely not as wealthy as he could have been if there wasn't this hard aspect from Saturn. Because Venus in the second house can give a lot of wealth. Okay, what else? Jupiter is ruling the 8th and 9th cusp, but the 8th whole sign, and it's in the 10th, clearly. 10th cusp, 10th whole sign. So 8th and the 10th signifies that the secrets, hidden things, occult awareness, research is all going into the public view. So this is very revealing, like similar to 8th Lord in the 7th house, where the secrets of the 8th house are coming out and he's going to tell them. He's going to reveal a lot of hidden things, a lot of secrets, a lot of occult understanding in the way that he understands it, or his deep research. It might not be considered occult. It might just be like through a lot of research, a lot of deep thinking. He's also got the support of Pluto here to his north node and Neptune. So that's prominent. Jupiter's also ruling the 11th house, which is why he was so, and it's in Aquarius, so a lot of very big thinking. Aquarius thinks about society. And that's why he's like, coming up with these philosophies of perpetual peace, democracy, cooperation between nations. That's very Aquarian. Let's pull up his Draconic chart. Interestingly enough, he's got Mars and Taurus in the first house in his Draconic chart, pretty much conjunct the north node. And then Venus and Aries conjunct the moon. And these are trading places again. So that's interesting. At first I was like, I don't really see Mars in the first house, but it was very initiating. I mean, he was very like, he did tons and tons of stuff. Like his work just spans everything, and that doesn't come from somebody who's just sitting on their butt doing nothing. Like Mars in the first house gets you moving. Maybe not Mars in Taurus, but Mars in general. But it's also mutual reception by, not by degree, but by sign with Venus in the 12th house. So again, bringing that 12th house knowledge and creativity into the first house, into the conscious arena. Venus is also conjuncting moon. And, this moon is actually pretty, it needs some good Venusian love and joy because, well, Venus is rules the sign of its exaltation, Taurus, and Venus is joy. Venus is pleasure and leisure. And this moon is in Aries in the 12th conjunct Mercury, square Saturn, square Mars. So even though it does have a mutual reception with Mars, so it does get the Cancerian energy, it's kind of roughly treated. Mercury is neutral, but 12th house, Aries, Aries isn't terrible for the moon, but it's definitely not an easygoing moon with the squares to Mars and Saturn. So anyway, I think this Venus helps the moon. It adds a level, an element of pleasure and joy that he might not have otherwise had. Pluto appears in Leo in the fourth quadrant, fourth whole sign house, which is interesting. Could be something difficult about his childhood that I don't really know about, other than that it was very difficult. It's squaring his natal sun and Uranus, so that's pretty intense, and it's dispositing the sun. So No, the sun is dispositing it. Sorry, sorry. So that's actually good for this Pluto. I don't know what it really means because I don't know enough about him, but it could potentially mean some kind of abuse, especially with these squares, abuse from the father, potentially being in the sign of the father, square from the sun. Anyway, Uranus in Virgo, again, that hardworking, independent thought that he was really a proponent of. That's what the Enlightenment was about. Thinking for yourself, having the courage to think for yourself. That I fully agree with. I mean, I'm very Uranian myself. I don't like to follow anything. I hold my own ideas above everyone's, and I think I don't not in an arrogant way. I think everyone should. I think it's just everyone's duty to think for themselves and to hold their own thinking ability above every book, every person, every authority, everything. You know, it's important. Saturn and MC and Scorpio in the 7th house. Now this also does not seem very conducive to marriage. I mean, Saturn alone can create a long-lasting marriage, but it definitely not easy. It rejects marriage, especially if it's not in good dignity, especially at first. But with South Node here and Scorpio, this just seems repellent towards any type of relationship. Jupiter is in Sagittarius, so I mean he's very, Jupiterian, obviously, and so that's quite telling. It's in the 8th house, so it protects him. Jupiter in the 8th house in good dignity is protecting him from 8th house, crisis and ruination. Planets in the 8th house they just periodically like suffer. That you'll go through events where they just like die, and if it's your sun, you can really lose reputation. I have my sun in the 8th house. Best way to resolve that is through 8th house things like astrology. But if I was like a politician with my sun in the 8th house, then I would, lose my reputation. That's why I do astrology and not politics. But Jupiter in the 8th house can protect him. That's protecting him from like crisis and early death and things of that nature. It's good luck. Jupiter's luck. It's in good dignity here. And it's also, great for understanding those deep hidden secret things. Great for that depth of awareness and thinking, especially in good dignity. Chiron in Aquarius, that's reinforcing that intellectual theme. It's Chiron has elements of Saturn and Uranus while being completely unique on its own, independent, because it's this weird shaped rock that defies definition, that floats in between Saturn and Uranus. It's very small compared. It's not a planet, but it is a big asteroid. So it's just very unique. But it does have this intellectual component. This very oddball, weird, reject, kind of wounded reject thing going on. That's also a healer and a teacher, and an astrologer and a shaman. So it plays many different roles, Chiron. Depends how it's aspected, positively, negatively, what sign it's in, where it's at. And then we also get the moon and Uranus in very high in the chart in Aquarius. So again, doubling over the theme of the Aquarian theme of thinking about society, very complex thinking, complicated intellectual pursuits, but brilliant at the same time. And then here we get the Piscean influence. He's very varied, right? He's not like a one-trick pony. Kant is very spread out. And this is pointing to his intuition, his thinking about intuition, the experience, the movement towards the spiritual, the attempt to scientifically bridge the spiritual reality with the intellectual, peace, his love of peace and theories about peace. Also Neptune, North Node conjunct Neptune. Neptune is the co-ruler of Pisces along with Jupiter. He's very Jupiterian, as well as Saturnian. And then Neptune and Chiron, that's similar to his like this idealism, scientific idealism, transcendental idealism. Very high-minded, you know. Anyway, guys, I think that's enough for Immanuel Kant. Don't want to bore anyone. Touched all the main points, I believe. And I hope you enjoyed it. Hope you learned something. Hit that like button. It'll help me out a lot. Subscribe if you haven't already. And leave a comment if you like. Book a reading. My website is macroastrology.com. My email is macrogoldmachine@yahoo.com. And that's it. I will see you next time. All right, thanks. Bye.